There's quite an interesting political phenomenon happening these days that's initially sweeping across Europe from the east and has now also gone into countries, moved into countries such as Italy, and that is the nationalistic election movement that seems to be sweeping right across Europe, has yet to influence France or the UK, but Germany is the latest country where there has definitely been an increase in the popularity of the nationalist, anti-globalist type of parties that are also anti-immigration, mass immigration that is, so it's actually happening everywhere, and even in Sweden there's also been a push there for the newest left wing, the right wing government party, I should say, have actually now made big inroads and are now kingmakers in Sweden, and the old head of Prime Minister of Sweden's gone, so things are changing there as well. Now what I've got here is a couple of articles that I looked up online about this particular topic of globalism and rising nationalism in the world. And the first article I want to read you extracts from is from an online publisher called Quartz. I've never heard of. It's got a left-wing slant, and the second one will be is from the Wall Street Journal, presumably. It's from something to do with Wall Street anyway, and it's a little more to the right, which is not surprising. So first off, I'll just read these extracts from the Quartz article. A wave of nationalism seems to be sweeping across rich nations. From the UK's ill-tempered exit of the European Union to the America First policies of US presidential candidate Donald Trump and the rise of populist anti-immigrant movements in France, Eastern Europe and elsewhere. Drivers of nationalism include a slow economic recovery, an increase in people displaced across borders, and anxiety about terrorism, according to Haram Omba, an economist at the World Bank. Another factor which is perhaps not as appreciated is age. Many rich nations are all in the grips of a big demographic shift towards older populations, and ageing populations experience economic pressures that can lead to more nationalistic tendencies. So it's all our fault. It's all bastards that are actually moving to these countries to the right, and the virtuous youth of this world are being dudded by the looks of things. But I'll read on. In the UK referendum on EU membership, age was one of the biggest factors in how people voted, with 3/4 of young people opting to remain, whilst 68% of those over 65 wanted to leave. Many of the young on the losing side of the vote were bewildered by the shift towards insularity and the cutting of ties, which runs counter to their experience as hyper-connected global citizens. Now, there you go. You can tell which part of the political spectrum this particular article is coming from. Older people might be expected to vote for more cautious protectionist policies than younger people with a greater appetite for risk, openness to learning new skills, and fewer commitments to tying them to a specific place. But Onda's research shows that the economic effects of ageing populations are reflected in rising nationalism across the board, not just in the grey vote. Sort of undercuts their own argument here in this article, which I found quite interesting. But I'll move on. Why? Ageing populations become more dependent on imports, and that can make the economy a weaker trade partner. Older people consume more services like care and fewer consumer goods like smartphones. As a result, makers of goods may move abroad to get closer to more lucrative markets, so their former homes have to import the products that they once purchased locally. Many services have to be delivered domestically, and these companies will benefit from rising demand. But care homes are often less innovative than smartphone makers, so ageing service-orientated economies risk becoming less productive in the long term. That, along with the dwindling prospects for manufacturing-related jobs, can dampen earnings for large groups of workers. In former industrial centres in the UK, for example, this has fuelled hostility towards outsiders like migrants from poorer EU countries who are perceived as taking increasingly scarce jobs from locals and generally depressing wages for skilled and entry-level positions. Now, the thing is, I would have to take exception to one of the things that they just said in this particular paragraph, and that is about the dwindling prospects for manufacturing-related jobs. Well, I beg to differ in the context of what's happening in America right now. They have had a renaissance in manufacturing jobs in the US, and they are one of the ageing countries. They're actually got a higher medium age than Australia, only marginally. It's 38 years of age as opposed to 37.5 in Oz. So I don't buy that particular argument, although I do agree that low-skilled workers from specifically, I think, Poland in the case of the UK, has caused hostility in the UK because of cutting wages and they might just be working harder than the locals. That happens in Australia as well. It's not an isolated situation with the UK by any means. In this context, cutting immigration, imposing tariffs and erecting other trade barriers becomes an increasingly popular means to protect beleaguered domestic firms and workers. But if this provides retaliation by trade partners, the older, less competitive economies have more to lose. Yes, some firms would come back home, but the losses from paying more for imports and earning less from exports are much greater than those gains, Onda says. Well, again, I would like to cite what's happening in the US, specifically between the US and China, where Trump has called China's bluff. Now, they are in a strong position, mind you, because America imports a hell of a lot more from China than they export back to China. So they are in the strongest position, and Trump knows that, and he's not going to let that advantage slide. And that's why I think he's a great leader, because he's actually doing things in the interests of Americans, and I think that's wonderful, and I wish we had some gutsy politicians in Australia that would do the same. But I've got a lot to say about our attitude to China coming up, I assure you, and it's not complimentary. So I think we're being played for mugs, to be honest with you. So now I'll move on to the one from Wall Street, and this is written by Martin Hutchinson. And interestingly enough, this is actually published on December the 17th in 2015. Even though it was published then, I think it's got quite a bit of relevance to today, so it's quite prescient in a way. Okay, so the title of this particular article is "The Consequences of Europe's Nationalisation Trend, the Political Status Quo Just Took Another Hit." In the latest bout of nationalism to sweep across Europe, Marine Le Pen's Front National Party scored unexpectedly strong gains in the recent French regional elections. In the first round of voting, it won 6 of the 12 regions, scoring 28% of the vote, topping the two main Republican and Socialist parties. While it failed to build on these gains in last weekend's second round, it could have held its lead in any of the regions, finishing second in 4 of them. The party won 6.8 million votes and has tripled its number of regional councillors. It will now have a presence in every region. It's the trend that has far-reaching implications. And boy, was he right there. Economic and cultural concerns. Naturally, globalists and the EU bureaucracy hate these nationalist parties. Well, I would come back and say that I can't stand European bureaucrats. They're some of the worst example of out-of-control bureaucracy you'll ever see. Talk about busybodies from Brussels. It's unbelievable. But more insidious is the way that now they're actually crippling the internet access for independent content providers. It's just disgusting. So it can be frustrating, this bureaucracy, but it also is very insidious when it comes to issues like free speech. For the economically minded, the nationalists raise new barriers or re-erect old ones, restricting the free movement of goods, services and people. For those concerned about race and religious relations, the nationalists represent an evil resurrection of old ethnic and religious antagonisms best consigned to the dustbin of history. And yet, despite these concerns, I'm not so sure I agree. While there's little argument against the free movement of goods, the free movement of people is a different question. Totally agree on that one. It depresses the wages of poor people in rich countries, raises the costs of assimilation, creates additional welfare burdens, generates crime, and even leads to terrorism. And I do agree that the free trade is something that we should promote. That's the only globalist agenda I would actually support, because it increases the standard of living in both rich and poor countries. So it's a good thing all round, and it's led to our incredible wealth that we have now, which I think could be improved a lot by cutting some of this bureaucracy, which is with some of the regulations and bureaucracy in the rich countries is really holding back potential growth, in my opinion. As for the ancient antagonisms, if those even still exist, they should be accommodated peacefully rather than suppressing local differences and homogenising cultures into a mishmash. And I would agree there that the nationalist push is great when it comes to these countries retaining their own culture, and bravo for them for that. But the downside, of course, is what's happened in Europe in the past. There's been incredible amount of conflict because of the nationalism, and probably the most disgraceful and wasteful example of that was the First World War, which was a pointless war which lost millions of people, died for virtually nothing, and absolutely just basically set up the Second World War. That seems to be the only thing it did, so that was just a shocker. So economically speaking, European nationalists have a lot in common. They're generally protectionist, believing that free trade has hollowed out the job market for the inhabitants of rich countries with limited skills and education. Within the EU, there isn't much they can do against imports from lower wage countries in Eastern Europe, but they represent a significant force against new free trade treaties such as the proposed Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. This isn't much of a policy shift for France, which has always been protectionist, but it's a significant one for Poland and Hungary, which have always favoured the capitalist free trade ideal. Protectionists also favour the construction of national champions, especially in Poland and Hungary. Their major local companies and banks were all sold to foreigners in the 1990s at knockdown prices, destroying the significant local capabilities. In France, no such period ever occurred. Building national champions can be ruinously expensive, although there are French eccentricities such as the Électricité de France's nuclear power station program, which generates 80% of France's electricity. Take note, Australia, you can actually have nuclear power and live comfortably. It is possible, so I wish this ridiculous phobia against nuclear power in Australia was got over. It is just absurd. Immigration concerns. Europe's nationalist parties also object to immigration because of its effect on job markets and its tendency to produce ghettos of unassimilated immigrants. Of course, Poland and Hungary don't have significant immigration. Indeed, both are major sources of emigrants to Western Europe, but their hostility to new immigrants is as much a matter of economics as xenophobia. Yes, quite interesting that they haven't had the shock that, say, Germany encountered with 1 million refugees in 1 year, which is just ridiculous, and Merkel should be hung, drawn and quartered for that, in my opinion. And well, her time is coming. She's virtually lost power now anyway, and that's great news. But the poor people of Germany have had to suffer under her ridiculous policies, which have now basically been totally exposed for what they are. It's just unsustainable. I thought that was quite good, and remember, that was written in 2015, which I find remarkable. Please consider subscribing to my channel if you think there's anything there of use to you, or entertainment or whatever. And either do that or give me a thumbs up, or if you're feeling really energetic, do both. That'd be great. But please don't ignore me. That's the worst thing you can do on YouTube, is be ignored.